Good morning. Welcome to the Museums Alaska and FAI, First Alaskans Institute, hosted webinar on Centering Indigenous Knowledge. We're really excited to have you with us this morning, and I'm going to let Dixie do our welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the first of our 6 webinar series with First Alaskans Institute. My name is Dixie Clough. I think most of you know me, but if you don't, I'm the director of Museums Alaska. I began my position last April and moved to Alaska last May. So I haven't been here very long. I moved here from Florida, but I mostly grew up in Maryland, right outside of DC. So that's a little bit of my background. And when I started this position, I spoke with several board members and museum colleagues in Alaska. And I heard many times that fostering meaningful relationships with Alaska's tribes and indigenous peoples was something that a lot of museums wanted to do, but maybe didn't necessarily know how to go about doing it. So we in Museums Alaska were very interested in creating a program that would help museums kind of figure out appropriate ways to reach out and build these relationships and hopefully keep them going into the future. But we also knew that we couldn't do it alone. To be perfectly blunt, I am a white woman who moved to Alaska last year. I am not the person to lead these conversations. I know about the museum practice side, but I'm not Alaska Native, and I can't speak to the experiences that Alaska Natives have had when visiting or working or partnering with museums in the past. But I knew that there was an organization in Alaska that could help build that bridge that gap. And in talking to my board members, at the very top of our list of potential partners was First Alaskans Institute. And right when we were planning to reach out to really start talking about creating a program like this and what that might look like, the Alaska State Library announced that they had received ARPA funds, and they were kind enough to share it with the museum world, which was so generous of them. And we knew that we had to jump on the opportunity, and we knew that this program was probably a really great fit for that funding. So a partnership email that we intended to send that would start a build up and become a great, maybe a slower partnership, became more of an email that was like, oh my goodness, there's funding. Can you create a virtual program with us right now? And First Alaskans was amazing, and they jumped right into it with us. So we've been working on this program since last year when we heard we got the funding, and we're so excited to launch it today. I wanted to send a huge thank you to First Alaskans Institute. Every time I've had meetings with Cutmen, I have been blown away by their thoughtfulness and all of the details to this program. And I know that these webinars are going to be an amazing resource for our community. And I hope we're able to continue this partnership into the future, because we know that there's a lot of work that museums need to do to right some wrongs and improve our practices. And I just can't wait to jump right in and get started. And I hope that everyone else feels the same way and is right there with me. So I'm going to stop talking and send it right back over to First Alaskans. Thank you.
Brianna, Dixie. So we're going to start with our host introductions. I'll go ahead and start. Chumai hui Candace Branson up the Ahtna Cutmen Jinamisullanga at Dahaloa. My name is Candace Branson. I go by Cutmen, which is my Sugpiaq name. I live and work in Kodiak, Alaska. And I'm the Indigenous Advancement Director for First Alaskans Institute. Very excited to host you today for these conversations. And I look forward to getting to know you all as well. I'm going to pass it over to Kacey, Qunmiġu, please.
Yeah, uvla lodak atira Qunmiġu nalawagamitun Kacey Hopson Iñupiaq angayukaka Muriel Hopson Lu Safdar Hussein Lu Asi Atataka Ben Hopson Senior Lu Qerenyara Lu Jeanette Hassan Jani Lu Patlavan Khan Lu. So good morning, everyone. I just briefly introduced myself in Iñupiaq. I am learning Iñupiaq whenever I can, here and there when I get the opportunity. So forgive me if I make any mistakes or if anybody tunes into the webinar later. But I think it is a beautiful thing to reclaim our languages when we can. So what I said was that I go by Qunmiġu. My English name is Kacey. I am Iñupiaq from the communities along the North Slope of Utqiagvik and Ologonic. Ologonic is also known as Wainwright in English. And at First Alaskans Institute, I serve in our Alaska Native Policy Center in the realm of Indigenous and Government Affairs. My parents are Muriel Hopson and Safdar Hussein. My grandparents are Jeanette Hopson, the late Jeanette Hopson and Ben Hopson, as well as the late Hassan Jani and Pathuman Khan. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today, and just really looking forward to the chance to really dive deep over the course of this series in these really important topics, and just thankful as well that, you know, Museums Alaska has wanted to help to create this series as well alongside us. It's a really incredible opportunity to just have these conversations that we always, we know that people have been wanting to have. So I'm looking forward to that. And we just want to take a moment to invite you all to join us in acknowledging the different Indigenous nations, Native nations that you may be calling in from. We know that many of you, if not most of you, are calling in from across Alaska. And so we welcome you in joining, we welcome you in acknowledging the Alaska Native nations who have since time immemorial and continue to do so today, stewarded and cared for these incredible lands whose abundance and beauty so many of us live off of now and call home. It's through their ongoing stewardship of this place, which is really our forever home, the place that will always be, that we're able to live here today. And that, you know, that goes for myself as well. And we also know that there may be those of you calling in outside of Alaska, and we also would encourage you to acknowledge the Indigenous nations on whose lands that you are able to make your home on, and also to find out, if you're not sure whose lands you're on, to find out. And there are ways that you can do that. There's a handy resource that people have created. Maybe I can ask one of our co-hosts to put it in the chat at some point. Will allow you to locate, to find that out. But regardless of where you're calling in from, we just ask that you join us in finding ways to recognize, honor, and offer, you know, our gratitude to the people upon whose lands that we are able to live on today, and also find ways to enact this through meaningful action, of course, in your work, but also across, you know, all of our communities. And I think if we can really commit to learning from and meaningfully including and holding space for our Indigenous peoples, then we will be that much farther along in the work that we desire to do together. Thank you. So Dixie actually gave a really wonderful overview already about part of the purpose, or our purpose for being here in this webinar today. So I don't want to add too much more, but you know, Dixie acknowledged that museums in Alaska, many are really wanting to try to do better in terms of building relationships with Native communities, in recognition of an often difficult past that we've had with Indigenous communities. And so, you know, I'm sure all of you are here today as well, because, you know, you're here at a Centering Indigenous Knowledge webinar for a reason. So I'm thankful for the time that we live in now, that we can have these conversations, because, you know, even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, collectively, we weren't at a place to be able to do that. And so through this series, we really just are seeking to elevate the voices of Indigenous peoples and perspectives about their experiences. Sorry about that. Their perspectives about their experiences within museums and what decolonizing and indigenizing can look like. Alaska always will be a Native place. So we truly feel that what is good for Alaska Native people is good for all people. And through the series, we hope to also prepare museum professionals to be able to discuss these challenges and experiences, you know, within their specific communities that they work with, and to, you know, even touch on challenging experiences in history such as, you know, the removal of our ancestors from our communities. Those are important topics to be able to talk about, and doing it in a good way. At the same time, we know that figuring out how to have those conversations is really challenging. So through this series, we may touch on some hard topics, but I think it is really important that we embrace those hard moments. It may be uncomfortable, but what's more uncomfortable is not being able to, not being able to have these conversations at all, because then that continues the divide that we have within our communities that can sometimes exist. Not all communities are the same, of course. So, I think with that, I really see each and every one of us in coming here today, embracing our responsibility and our opportunity to create something better that all of us know really can exist. So I'm thankful for all of us gathering today. Just invite you all to really engage and lean in, and just Qunmiġu for your willingness to have these conversations with us. And I think with that, I'll pass it over to you, Cutmen.
So at this time, we want to invite our guest speakers to introduce themselves.
All right, there we go. Willie Jan and Sarota, Melissa Shaginoff Sisatuan, Yudishioth Koikada Etlan, na Itini Anak Kayak Sinsiaden, anti-artist curator Gogashna, Chinan Kotanos no Will Ozet no Otlan. Hello, my name is Melissa Shaginoff. I am Caribou and Fish Eater Clan from Naitiniana, or the Log Over the River, or Chickalon Village. I'm an auntie and an artist and a curator, and I've worked in various spaces and capacities within museums and institutions, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of familiar names on the call, and so that feels really good. I do a lot of work in my practice as to communicate, to visit, and to spend time with people. I think that this work and decolonizing, indigenizing, changing institutional museum practices, first starts with us knowing each other and doing those long introductions and realizing where we come from, because that's important. I think we're past the time where we need to be just part of the institution. We're individuals and we're unique cultures all within museums and institutions, and recognizing those things makes us stronger, which is kind of the way I've always worked, in my art practice and museum practice is people first, individual first, those unique things that make us special, but also make us really related. So,
Chanan. Yarrow, would you like to go next?
Sure. Sakcha yeyachat duasauk, yesh nachat siti, shawak kwana yachat, gana khadichat siti kuchit dakayachat, Lingít yechat siti. My name in Lingít is Akjaye. I am from the Lingít Nation of the Raven Moiety. I am Gana Adi clan, which means the people of Ganach, which is a little bay just north of Ketchikan in Beam Canal. And I come from the Martin House, which is from Klawak. So I am Klawak Kwan from the village of Klawak. And my English name is Yarrow Vaara, and I have kind of a varied background. So I look forward to being a part of this whole cohort and seeing what everyone else has to say. And I hope I have some valuable things to share with you all. Good
Lisa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Kuya na First Alaskan Institute, kuya na Cutmen, Qunmiġu, Kenayi, Iliganamig, Ublalo atak, kuang alisa Navraq kalhakpak Ellanna, Iñupiaq gurunga, ugiwag miugurungas, nazwa miugurungalu, sulikikiktaru miugurunga. I'm from King Island, Nome, and I'm also from Kacey. Fairbanks me inu rungamat nami. I'm living in Fairbanks right now on the original and unceded lands of the Tanana people. Katawik Cultural Center me sawaktunga sitnazwami. I work at the Katawik Cultural Center in Nome, and I'm working remotely, temporarily, finishing up school. Ake ya Margaret Puyo ano ka Ellanna sitnazwami yorok. Puyo bang miyo gorongalo. Puyo bang miyo goroklo. Ange ka Herman karutakes kat ya miyo gorok. Kikita miyo gorok. Suli, my mom is Margaret Puyo Anoka from King Island, and my dad was Herman Hess from Kayana and Kotzebue. Avaga Ellanna Suli Nigirok Ugyuvak Miu Wurok, Aluak Newton Frank Stanislaus Ellanna was my grandfather from King Island. Nagautamana Ugatnak Naluang Newton Ursula Grace Ellanna. She was from Shishmaraf, my grandmother, and also from Kawerak or Mary's Igloo. I also have ancestry from Minnesota and Denmark. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a very important conversation.
Qunmiġu, to our three wonderful speakers for joining us today. I'm just so excited. Thank you all as well for stepping in and being willing to share your perspectives, and just being willing to, in that way, help others learn what it can be like as Indigenous peoples to engage with our museums, the good and the and the bad. So I guess I would just like to kick things off with an opening question. What do you wish museum professionals knew about what it's like to be a Native person walking through a museum? If you want, you can share about your own personal experiences or tell a story, whatever you feel like best answers the question. So I'll just repeat it once more. What do you wish museum professionals knew about what it's like to be a Native person walking through a museum?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just open up something because I think it's probably something that many Indigenous people feel, is that these things aren't that far away from us, these collections, that they're actually very close, and they're connected to us, they're ancestors, and they're alive, and that I think sort of standard museum practices of caring for those things are in many ways go against the way that we would care for them and treat them. I think that things sort of being held sort of in stasis, a lot of these things would be passed between clans, and they would kind of live a life alongside of us, right? And sometimes I feel like museum collections and institutions has sort of stopped that story, so I feel like that our collections and heritage objects that are within institutions, that they're living, and that they're actually very closely related.
Yeah, Qunmiġu, Melissa, for sharing that. That's powerful, and that is a huge difference in the way that we can we approach what it's like to be in a museum, and what it's like to engage with these cultural objects, because in many ways they're not objects to us, as you just articulated. So thank you for speaking to that. Either Yarrow or Lisa, do you want to share?
Yeah, so that's kind of a large topic, if there's such a varied response to that. And so all I have is, my own personal experiences. Growing up as a child, I didn't know much about my Native culture. My mother was raised in foster homes and didn't know a lot about it either. I knew we were Lingít, but I didn't know much more than that. I knew the village that we were from, but I had never been there. And I was always fascinated by stories or pictures and books and all kinds of things. So I spent a lot of time in libraries and museums when I was a kid, which might be a little unusual for a child, I suppose, but it was fascinating to me. It was a place that felt home, you know, and so I spent some time. There was a demonstration that was happening in the Anchorage Museum. Anyway, so my mom was attending this weavers gathering that was happening and was really fascinated by watching the weaving demonstrations. And pretty soon the woman that was doing it noticed that we had come back and had been there all day. And she looked at my mom and she hands her the stuff. And my mom starts doing what she was doing. And she had had kind of an emotional day and was kind of crying in the corner over there. And people were coming up and asking questions. And my mom had been listening to her answering the same question all day. So she just jumped in and started filling in for her. And the people coming up didn't know that we hadn't been doing that all our lives. And it was really the strangest feeling. And then later there was a presentation in the theater where a woman was up front talking about Chilkat robes. And she had a couple of old ones and a newly created one that were up on the stage, and she had seen my mom talking earlier and invited her up, knowing that she was Lingít, to come up and put that robe on. And my mother said, "Oh, no, but my daughter dances, so why don't we put it on her?" And I was about 14 at the time, and they put a Chilkat robe on me at the Anchorage Museum and let me dance it around. And I had the most unusual experience because I had never even touched one before. And as soon as that robe hit my shoulders, I started dancing up and down the aisles in the auditorium, and nobody stopped me. So pretty soon I'm dancing all the way through the whole museum, in the auditorium, in the lobby, and through some of the exhibits. And I don't even know how long I had worn it for, but it was almost like an out-of-body experience for me, being carried by the spirit of that robe. It was so happy to dance that I felt it, right? And it was just such a joyful moment, spinning and twirling and letting those fringes live and move. And so that was, you know, one of my shaping experiences as a child. And then, you know, going into museums in and around all over the place, I was able to see objects that are encased in glass or behind a red ribbon, or, you know, you can't get close to it. And I always want to get closer and have a personal connection with those things. And that's very meaningful, right? And then there's some times where I'd be walking through with my mother and she would just become overwhelmed with emotion and just have to leave the building, because there's just this like overwhelming kind of oppressive spirit about whatever was going on, and kind of unexplainable. And so, you know, we just sort of roll with it and be like, okay, well, I guess we're done here. This is really strange. And then there's other times where you see exhibits that really touch and move somebody. Yesterday, I was working at the State Museum here in Juneau. I work as an on-call there part-time, and I'm not here representing them at all, but as an individual. But I had a person come through and she was so excited to share and to talk, and she'd bought some Paiute wool at the store down the street and was excited to show us it, and was looking at the muskox we had on display up above the lobby. And I told her where she could see one of the mountain goats we had and look at some of the weavings that were done with the mountain goat wool. And she came back out several hours later in tears that this was just the most like remarkable experience for her. So, you know, it can be both sides of that scale, right? It can be emotional in a lot of ways, but educational as well. And so some of the most, I guess, poignant experiences are when we've had groups of children come through with the drum and sing and bring life to those objects, to, involve them in living culture. And so, those are some of the things that I think are very important to address, right? Is that the experience of walking through a museum can have a lot of different things. There was another moment I was at the museum in Denver. I had done some archaeology work and was there as as a participant in a conference. And they happened to be recording some native language. They wanted to do a brief greeting to play. And so they decided to include Lingít on there and recorded me saying good morning or something to that effect in Lingít on their video. And years later, my friend emailed me and she's like, hey, I just saw you at the museum in Denver. What are you doing down there? Right. And so having those voices be accessible is another, important thing that I think is experience, right? Is not just seeing the stationary object as it is, but hearing and experiencing the perspective of a Native individual's living culture, as I said again, right? So I think that is a pretty good place to pass it off to our next speaker there.
Yarrow, really appreciate you speaking about that as well. Those were some really powerful stories. I was just imagining you in that robe, dancing around that museum, and the moment of when it went on your shoulders, and how you talked about how it was just this incredible, almost out of body experience, and how much the robe really desired to be used for what it was meant to be used for. I think that's a really powerful story that just captures so much of what, why it's so important to be able to have this conversation, right? And to really, it really helps to paint the picture of what we mean when we say breathing life into our cultural heritage items, and through that we're breathing life and energy into who we are as people as well. So I'm going to Lisa, if you wanted to share, we would love to hear your thoughts as well.
I'd like to echo what they both said, that we see ourselves in those exhibits as we are now. We relate to them directly. We have a spiritual connection to those items and those ancestors right now. And like Yarrow said, when you see young people from your community going into the cultural center or the museum, and you see their faces light up when they see themselves reflected back to them, and that their identities are validated, and that they see their languages displayed prominently, and they get to feel pride in who they are. That's extremely core to what we do at the Qunmiġu Cultural Center. That was the vision of the elders 30 years ago, when they conceived of the need for a place to share who we are with the world, in my region, in Nome, Bering Strait region. So one of the other things that I think about when I walk into another museum, not the one in which I work, any other museum, like into so many across the United States, I wonder if the museum professionals of that place have connected with the tribal community or the Native peoples, the indigenous peoples of that place in a meaningful way. And I think of the recent history. And when I say recent history, I mean the past 400 years. And I think about what a difficult time it has been for indigenous peoples of this, this world. And and I think about the level of voice or lack of voice that Indigenous people have had. And that continues, that story continues. And having a good understanding of the history of the place in which you're operating a museum is absolutely critical. Did the museum professionals of this museum connect with the people, the original people of this land, and hear their voice and hear what they had to say, and make them create a situation where it's safe to be equal partners in the design and curation and planning, opening, showing of these things of life, right? These ancestors. So Indigenous people have long memory. There's long memory. You can walk into like a science conference and there's scientists that are talking about the last 30 years of data and extrapolating trends from that data. And you can go to a native elder's, house and have a conversation over a cup of coffee about the past 300 years of data that they might know. So there's long memory in our communities. So being curious about, I would be curious about what the museum professionals have done to engage in a really meaningful partnership way with the Indigenous peoples of the place that the lands that museum sits on, and have they heard their voice? So yeah, I think that connection that Indigenous people have it transcends the physical, and I think that I went to a exhibit, and there it was describing a certain ceremony from my community, and it was concerning because you can't just freely and openly talk about that ceremony. That's sacred knowledge that is a very important tool in our spirituality to unify the community. But there is an expense if you utilize that tool, if you engage the spirit world in that ceremony. The people of the community know that it's going to cost a life. The spirit world is going to say, in exchange for utilizing this tool to unify your community, somebody's going to come to the spirit world and be with us. So that ceremony is not talked about openly. It's not shared freely. It's sacred knowledge that only a few people need to talk amongst themselves about, and it takes years to plan for that ceremony. And in that planning process and preparation for that ceremony, it unifies the community. But it's done in a somber understanding that, we are in this place where our community has had discord. Now we need to come together, but we know it's going to cost us something. And so it's not talked about very lightly. And if you talk about it too much, you can get sick. So displaying ceremony or talking about Native or Indigenous ceremony is a very sacred thing, and it needs to be approached very carefully. So I think that, that conversation hasn't happened.
So many good nuggets there. Oh, go ahead, Cutmen. I just wanted to, share my appreciation for what all three of you have already brought into this conversation. And I especially appreciate what you shared, Lisa, just now about, did you connect with the original people of the land, hear what they had to say, create opportunity to be equal partners, not just in the showing of the items, but in the design and the curation and the planning, all of that, all along the way. And that powerful story that you shared just now about that ceremony is really sacred as well. Cutmen?
Yeah, so much of what you shared in your responses are related to that relationship, building relationships with our Native communities and the relationship of our people with our ancestral items, and such powerful stories already. Thank you. The next question we wanted to ask was, whose story are we telling? Whose story are museums telling? And how does that impact the community and our relationship, or museums' relationship, with tribes and Native people?
I was thinking a little bit about this because, just listening to Yarrow and Lisa, I think that when you're talking about story and about what is sort of the take home, for the visitor of a museum, I think it's important to recognize too that just having exhibits about Native people, right, there is like a certain dynamic that's created, and I think about in Alaska, the very common sort of stories that are told, right, of the people of Alaska are the Native people and the pioneers, right? And those two things are portrayed in many ways in very different lights. And I think that, that many museums, including, many individuals in this room, are working towards, countering that idea that Native people don't exist anymore, that Native people are not around, that we're not of the past, right? But pioneers have always been, even just by their name, their name is both a noun and an adjective, in Alaska, right? Is that there's this sort of perseverance and thriving and survival, kind of perspective, right? So I think that it's really important, that that Native people be telling our own stories, right? And that there needs to be some sort of public, recognition of individuals, from individual communities, from individual cultures. This perspective of Alaska Native people as kind of a monolith is something that's, that I think that we've all seen, and many institutions, many museums, many people in this room again are working towards undoing. But honestly, it just takes like one story, right? One story to kind of get it wrong, to kind of like have this sort of trickle down effect, because museums and institutions are looked at as the authority, So how do we sort of redirect that authority to make that stories come directly from the source, And when it comes directly from the source, we're no longer part of history. We're part of this continuum, of being here a very long time, right? And I think that, part of that also, and, some people have heard me talk about this, is that museums can't just like change the work, right? They can't just change their wording and be okay. There needs to be some sort of active recognition of the way museums have misportrayed Indigenous people in a public way. And that's a really decolonized Indigenous way of being, when you recognize publicly, what's been happening, right? Because it's all about sort of getting things out in the open and working through them and talking about why and how the story is changing, why and how the content of this, this label is being changed, and who's directing it, right? That it needs to happen in public, and needs to happen in this way that is very much, acknowledging the sort of, mishistory, or, kind of construing of Alaska as this sort of frontier new place, right? Because Alaska, is a very old, a very cared for place. And all those things are just kind of false narratives, right? So how do you do this in public? Because I think that, part of, deciding what story is to be told is also deciding too, that acknowledging where there's been some inequities, and where there's been stories that have been told that have intentionally left Indigenous people out, because that's how you work through these things though too, is that you have to sort of in a public way recognize them and move forward, right? You need to recognize, where your archive, maybe spelling, Ahtna, Ahtna, not Ahtna, which makes, it really difficult for me to go into collections and search my own people when it's misspelled, right? All those changes have to be done in a public way. And I think that when they are, it makes it much easier for people, for Indigenous people to enter in these spaces and feel like it's being changed because it's out of consideration and it's out of telling the truth, so I got a little off topic, but I think that the story needs to be told by us, and it can only really be done in a public way. Changing your story tomorrow, to include Indigenous people is not enough. There needs to be some acknowledgement of what the past story was and why it was changed. And it's not about, kind of pointing the finger as like someone did something wrong. But I think that, not being transparent about that is trying to protect these sort of past academics, when we really should be trying to protect, our people today and the youth today and our community today. And that includes protecting me, that includes protecting Indigenous people and standing up for them, So if you look at your position as like within the institution as someone who is protecting, that also means recognizing, where the things are paining, where those things are hurting, yeah. Okay, Jeanette.
Koyana. Yeah, I think that if museums were to make those changes and make it very clear as to why and their motive and how they're making that change, would really lead and leave an example for other museums to follow suit, and not just the why, but how they're making those changes, be a total resource for the whole museum institution. How so awesome. Great ideas. I'm going to go to Lisa.
Yeah, whose story are we telling, right? And from whose perspective is that story being told? I guess answering these questions with other questions to kind of evoke those thoughts is what the direction I'm going, I guess. Who's benefiting from the story that you're choosing to tell, with or without the consent and equal participation of the community that you're working with? Under what assumptions are you working? Right? We all come to the table with assumptions, and maybe the entire project is based on an assumption that you have, right? We all have to kind of lay down our assumptions on the table and take a look at where we're coming from, as professionals, as leaders, as servant leaders in our communities. Nobody makes a lot of money working for nonprofit museums, right? We're all not in this for the money. We're in this because we love it, right? We love the work we do. We care about telling stories. We care about the importance of people knowing about who we are. But I think it's a really important thing to, as you're thinking about how to share the voice of the community, or how to partner equally in agency and capacity, right? Giving the platform back to the original voices of the area. What are the power dynamics in your community? It's really important to understand that. What are the leadership dynamics of not just your museum board or your trustees, but of the city itself, right? It can be vastly different than the museum community's take on the situation, right? So being aware of those things is very important, not to the detriment of your project, but just to be aware of it as you're moving forward, and how to approach that conversation about curation of a certain project. Those making sure that no matter what the power dynamics are in the community, that equality and equity is at the very top. Equity is at the very top of the work that we do. And I think there's been a lot of, like Melissa said, there's been a lot of stories told about that brave pioneer community. And not to discount that story, that's an important story. But it's been at the expense many times, at the expense of lives, at the expense of entire communities. And we have to recognize that. And like Melissa said, not to point fingers or blame, but we have to be honest and we have to be aware of the communities that we are living in, that we are sharing space with, that we are on the lands of, and of the voices that are that have the agency and capacity to be able to be heard. I was at a DVSA conference a couple years back, and Qunmiġu, you were at that meeting. We had people that had lived in women's emergency shelters due to domestic violence present. There were people who had experienced, very horrible things at that meeting in order to be heard by the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And there were city officials at this meeting as well. The board for CDVSA was meeting. So at this meeting, some of the people who had been living in emergency shelters due to domestic violence finally had a forum to speak up. And boy, did they ever. It was really powerful. Okay, I'm sorry. So at this meeting, the city officials that were present got to hear from the voices in the room. And the most powerful thing I heard as a museum professional and as a survivors advocate at the same time, the person said to the city council people present that they were looking through the historic preservation plan and the city's priorities for the next 5 years, I think it was. And the number one priority was to beautify Front Street, preserve the historic value and beauty of Front Street. And Nome is a gold rush town, right? And yet Nome was experiencing some of the most difficult rates of very yucky things, right? So she spoke up and she said, how can that be your number one priority? So we have to be cognizant of what's going on in our communities. We have to be cognizant of what the issues are, the power dynamics. Have there been communities that have been disenfranchised where you are? How do we elevate those voices? What are their priorities? What are everybody's priorities in this land, right? Are we hearing all the voices? So I don't know if I answered the question.
You definitely sparked some good thought.
Yes, both of you did, both of you.
Well, our next question is, how can museums decolonize the stories? or narratives that they perpetuate about Indigenous people?
Well, I think this is pretty obvious, right? But it's to, is to let us tell our own stories, right? But like deeper than that, deeper than just bringing people in to review, written information, or I think that that we need to look at, if we have the power, and even if we have just the voice within our institution to speak this, is that we need to be making positions, specifically designed and created for Indigenous people within our collections, within our museums, within our curatorial roles. I think that I think that we need to start looking at Native knowledge as a special, as a special skill, right? As a kind of like an authority within these places, right? Indigenous people know how to care for collections, know how to care for our cultural objects in a way that that is about their whole life, that it comes from a long sort of research that that starts when we're quite young, right? That we can care for these things in a different way, right? And we certainly will, tell our stories in a different way, right? And I think that when we're talking about centering these things, it doesn't just mean as a one-off, that there needs to be some sort of commitment to these changes, right? And this is about balancing the inequity, that is kind of inherent within museums and institutions, right? It's like, if we have museums and institutions that are constantly about us, it makes it very difficult, to change that dynamic, right? Because it's always just about us, right? So how is it done with us? How is it done by us? And can museums and institutions, start to really put some actionable and like real change, and it's not a temporary, curatorial position. It's not an invitation to a collections. It is like real and systematic and institutional change. It's establishing these positions as a long-term goal, right? And also, affording authority, towards Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people. And it's not that, difficult to imagine. We see this happening in Canada within universities, right? Indigenous elders are recognized, as professors, as knowledge keepers, right? We need to just do it, and I think that it's a lot. I know that everything has a level of difficulty to it, but I also think too that it's not about trying to get it perfect right away. I think that it's about bringing people in and just putting that effort forward, right? Because the process of change is ongoing, and it's a circle. It's not something like we're going to arrive at this endpoint where we're finally decolonized and everything is really great and wonderful at the institutions and museums for Native people. It's a process of change. It's going to take a long time, right? So why can't we start tomorrow, right? Why can't we start like right now, and just start making those little things and just watch them build upon themselves, But that's what this collaboration between Museums Alaska and First Alaskans Institute. It's this idea of looking at where the power dynamics lie and sharing power. So if you're looking at your position, your role within museums and institutions as a form of power, and you start to think about, well, maybe part of my job is to strategize how I share this power with other people. I think that it's going to make change a lot easier because, like you said, a few times, this is about relationships, right? This is about a long-term relationship, and if we truly know each other, I think that it makes those things feel even easier, because if you truly knew me, could you tell my story for me? No, you would tell me to tell my own story. So
Yes, decolonization is a process. And it seems like the more we at FAI get decolonized in our work, the more we learn that we need to decolonize. It's never going to be done. It's part of a long-term process that we're consistently engaged in and taking action on and learning more about. Thank you for bringing that up. It's so true, and I think something that needs to be talked about, because it's not like we'll ever reach the decolonized stamp of approval, and even though we're working on it every day. So it's a process that needs to be engaged on, and the sooner it's started, the better we all are. And I think decolonization is it seems like it's really based in that relationship building. Yeah, Yarrow, you did miss the question on whose story are we telling? And how does that affect our relationship with tribes and Native people? How does it affect the community? If you want to answer either or both of those questions.
Whose story are we telling, right? There's so many stories. It's not just one story. There's a variety of perspectives that are part of the story. And I think it's important to show multiple facets of that. It's easy to lump things together and to sort of generalize a Native experience, but it's different for each individual, for each tribe, for each group within the tribe. We've got here in Alaska, we have nearly half of the federally recognized tribes in the United States. And I don't know that that is necessarily represented very often. We've got so many Native languages that are different from each other and significant. And I don't think those are represented often enough. I know we've been, as a community, as in general and as a whole, I think we've been making great improvements in that direction, recognizing the Native languages and recognizing the sovereignty of Native tribes and even the mere existence of Native tribes. Legally, in the news lately, just this last couple of days. And I think that's important story to recognize, is that not everyone's story is the same. There are people who come in to a museum or to see an exhibit like that because they're looking for information that they don't have. There's people who come in that are looking for an experience that they don't have an opportunity for, or they're looking to share an experience with someone that they don't think has had that before, right? They're bringing a guest with them. And so those are all different stories. And there was one moment that I had gone to the Seattle Art Museum with my dad's wife, my stepmother, and they go there frequently. She had already been to this particular exhibit, but wanted me to see it. And it was fascinating throughout the entire thing that she was watching my reaction to what I saw, right? And she wasn't looking so much at the objects, but she wanted to see the things as I saw them. and she was curious what things I would pick up on, right? That I would look at the beading techniques, or how fascinating the little things were, or when I tried to get around behind something to see, you know, what else was there, or just the different things that I commented on were different from what she saw through her own eyes. And so that was for her a new experience, even though she had been there to the exhibit before, but to see it through the eyes of someone who knew those objects and recognized the techniques in making them. And so that's an important story, you know, that's there as well, to have the exhibit speak for itself, but also to have living people to experience it with. And so that's part of the story, right? That's part of our modern existence now today, is that those are, you know, sort of the refugee of, or the refuge of where we go to kind of experience those. And that's sort of an unfortunate, you know, factor of assimilation and acculturation, and there aren't as many places to have those cultural experiences anymore. But so it's important to have that as authentic as possible, right? And to represent those in a meaningful way that not only explains what it is, but explains like how it was made, right? That's what another reason why people would come, is they want to look at those old objects with the intention of recreating them, right? That's their only chance to visit those ancestors, their grandparents, the old ones that perfected technique for how many thousands of years, right? And so you want to look at the inside of the basket. You want to look at the underneath side of the hat. You want to look at the stitches, or maybe look at a couple of the ones that are coming out, right? Those are the kind of stories that the craftsman, the artisan is looking for, that may be different from someone who is just there to appreciate it as a whole. And so I think it's important to have opportunities that are different for those people. Such an emotional connection that comes with some of those as well, that, you know, it's great to have sort of a setting that creates this sacredness in a way, if you will, right? So it's not just about coming and looking at things, but it's about recognizing a frame of time, and how did those objects get to be where they are, right? Why is it significant that that piece has been preserved, and what does it represent now? And so I think it's important to tell both sides of that story, of the explorers and the cultural detriment that came along with it, right? Where the in-between times of the pre-contact existence, but we as a living culture experience these hardships and catastrophes and continuously, right? To the point where now that we're bringing those stories back again, and really holding up our children and our youth that are learning those things from birth, that are having those experiences that me and my mother's generation didn't have the opportunity for. And so those are all stories that should be represented in a living way. I believe that those are very important, and opportunities for people who are not part of the culture to come here. You know, that's a big part of why museums exist, is because people are interested and curious about those things. And so having them interpreted in a way that they can understand and walk away with the respect and knowledge of the area that they're in, whether it's for a moment, if it's for a couple of hours, whether they're spending the summer here, you know, those are all a different amount of information they're looking for. But for them to be able to walk away and say, wow, that was a really powerful experience, I think is ultimately the goal, right? And so as for the next question, I certainly could move into that one as well. Decolonizing the stories and the narratives. I think it's important to talk in the present, right? We exist. It's not they did this or they did that or all of these past tense expressions that I think is a real easy habit to get into, right? And yeah, we may be speaking about a different time, but you know, to say the Tlingit people subsisted on fish. Fish were very important to the Tlingit society. You know, that's putting it in a past tense. And I think one of the most important things to take out of this whole session, I believe, is to bring those references into the present tense, that we are here, we are living, and those cultures and practices do continue. And so I think those are very important, but also, you know, to go through and include as often as you can the native terms for things. What are those things made out of? You know, a little more information about why are they significant, or how is it used? What is the meaning of it behind it? To sort of set up these like sets of information, you know, using languages as much as possible, I believe, is very important. Setting the scene, right? Like even video or photography or something that shows objects in process or being used or being made, I think could really expand experiences of understanding. People look at a canoe that's hanging from the ceiling and they look at it and they see a boat. They don't necessarily see the tree that it came from, the amount of time that it takes to cure the wood or to select the right one or to carve each individual chip out of it, or the distance that it may have traveled. They could see some of the scratches on the bottom and can see that it had certainly been used, but the significance of how a single canoe could have upheld an entire community by allowing transportation and trade and access and travel to hunt and move around and bring resources in, and you know, that kind of thing, I think is kind of lost at times. And going back through, you know, some of the records, I've had a chance to look through some of the information that's been compiled, and looking at it from a certain perspective, I think is important, because those information was gathered by specific individuals and was recorded from their perspective, right? And so some of the titles or some of the information may not be as authentic as they could be. I think, you know, it's important to keep those references, but perhaps to add to them and to correct them and to spell them and, you know, represent them in a way that truly represents the cultures that they come from, using the native words and the languages, and not just being able to see it written, but in order to hear it, you know, backing that up with the audio and visual and the technology that we have today, I think is a valuable resource as well. Sound can be such a triggering memory, right? Is just the vibration of hearing something, or the pattern or the repetition of the ads work, you know, even any of those, the drum, the sound of a song, or the fire crackling, all of those things are part of an experience. And so I think it's important to show, you know, just a whole rounded environment like that, which I think we have opportunities to do better at. As far as decolonizing those things, you know, is just to maybe not filter out, but to present different perspectives of what those objects may have been recorded as, and to update and modernize some of them according to what society is moving towards today, right? Is terms of this sort of Indigenous revival and living culture, as I said, using terms that are outdated and words that have generic meanings, I think are a detriment to the experience of visitors coming in and understanding the gains that we've been making as a society. So I think those are important to show as well. Gunashish.
Gunashish, Yarrow, and also to Melissa and Lisa as well. I have just been basking in all of the things that you all have been sharing and just appreciating it so much. And some of the themes and the key ideas that I'm hearing come out already are the importance of having an equity approach to the curation of these cultural objects, you know, really asking yourself, who have communities been disenfranchised and how can you elevate those voices? What are the power dynamics at play? And, you know, I don't think it's really that difficult to look at history, look at the stories that are told, even look at our education curriculum and see that our power dynamics are very much tilted in terms of really telling the story of everybody who's come here to Alaska since the time of the pioneers, you know, the settlers, and so often at the expense of making sure that we're also making visible the Indigenous peoples who've always been here and who continue to call this place home. And so that I heard as a resounding theme throughout what everyone was saying, to really, you know, we need to acknowledge that so often, you know, we still run into people who are surprised when they find out that Native people still exist. And that is the consequence of living in a society that does a terrible job on the whole, of, you know, talking about and acknowledging and teaching about our peoples, even within our education systems. So that's part of, I think, you know, when I was listening to you, Lisa, about making sure you're looking at the bigger picture, the bigger context of the community, you know, looking at what are those power dynamics. If we exist in a society that right now still does not, again, for the most part, do a good job of acknowledging and uplifting Indigenous communities. And so that is the context that museums are already existing within, even if within a museum there may be the intention of changing that, you know. So I really appreciated that people brought that up. I heard the theme of sharing power as a strategy for decolonizing. If you're looking at the power dynamics, also asking yourself, in what ways can we share power? In what ways can we disrupt this ongoing kind of power dynamic that so often leads to the erasure of Indigenous peoples? And part of that involves, and what I heard you saying, Yarrow, and others, is telling the story of colonization. This was brought up also, I think, in the moment when your phone died, but also, you know, telling the story of the missteps that might have taken place within a museum institution, right? And it's not, as people said, it's not about pointing fingers, but it's about disrupting this kind of power dynamic that so often as Native people, we see ourselves only through a Western lens. We're only allowed to see ourselves through a Western lens when we walk through a museum. And so telling the story of colonization and also allowing us to tell our own stories is one of those ways that we can disrupt that lens. And I heard, you know, Melissa, you talk about the need for public recognition of those missteps. And it sounded like to me as a really important step for building trust or building better relationships with Native people is is not just, not just quickly fixing it, as fast as possible, but really just being honest about like, this is what the story was, and this is how we're changing it, and this is why it matters. So I heard so much synergy across all of what the three of you were sharing. And so I just really wanted to, I don't know, connect all of the dots in that way. And if there is anything that as you all were listening to each other, is there anything else that you felt called to share? Like maybe when, someone was sharing their story or their thoughts on it, if you had something that sparked within you that you wanted to add on and share, by all means, definitely. I want to make space for that before we go to our next question.
Thank you. I just wanted to just add to what Yarrow and Melissa were saying. Absolutely. Moving forward with absolute honesty, transparency, and equity in how our museums operate is super critical, and it's very scary. Honestly, it is putting the museum in a vulnerable position, to be very honest, to go that route, but it's super important to do it, and prepare yourself for it. Make sure that your trustees or your board is on the same page, that everybody's in this unified kind of effort to make sure that your institution operates from as much equity as possible. It is a scary process to enter into. Honesty, transparency, equity, so important. And like Yarrow was saying, talk in the present. Make sure your exhibits are in the present tense. Make sure that, like she said, the languages are prominent with the permission of the community, and that it originates from the voice of the Indigenous community. Like Melissa said, allow people to tell their own story. Very important. I'd just like to share a quick example of how we've centered a small piece of Indigenous knowledge in everything that we do. So first, human beings are not the only animals on this planet, right? And we think we are the pinnacle of creation. Actually, we're just one of so many. So an elder from Iñupiaq by the name of Teresa Moses said, the animals view compassionate and restrained humans as desirable, even pitiable. And Dr. Teresa John says the animals that allowed themselves to be harvested were honored. They were honored guests, and their spirits were thanked through expressions of dance, ceremony, and protocol. There's this thread of relationships again, and that how Alaska Native people, those objects that you're seeing in these museums, that you're working with, that you're interacting with, that you're having conversations with, these ancestors that you're interacting with, these objects come out of a community based in harmony, balance, awareness, definitely spirit and respect, and of course reciprocity. And I know that we need to explore that. We need to understand that more about the cultural heritage that we are hosting in our spaces. Vincent Picawana said he was a very amazing advocate for our cultural center before it was built. And he was in my office almost every day. And he would say he would just share knowledge so freely. And one of the things he said was, everything and every life form has awareness. Animals, plants, wind, land, and water, they can hear you. Everything has spirit, even the rocks. And he says it is the unity of the spirit. Super powerful, very powerful. So these objects are just not objects. These are not inanimate things. These are actual beings that we have relationships to. These are our ancestors, and they have life. And Vincent said one time in explaining about the drum, he said, so the spirit of the plants and the animals that you use to make a drum, they form an I, an iji. You have the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the sinew, the spirit of the walrus, the spirit of the whale. All these animals and plants come together and they form an I. And when in my community, when they're inflating a walrus stomach and scraping it and washing it for it to be a drum skin, it's called ijiqshaq, which means the material used to make an I. And then once that walrus stomach skin is onto the frame, it's called an iji, an I, a soyaq. It's a way to communicate with the spirit world. It's like a door, an I between our world and the spirit world. And all those spirits come together to make that I. And there's ceremony and protocol to everything. And understanding that is super important. Lastly, I would like to say, pay people, pay them. Indigenous people have volunteered their knowledge for a long time and not been represented equitably and not been paid. So when we have visiting curators, when we have visiting artists, we have contracts drawn up and we have honorariums paid and we have contract and we pay for their, everything, right? Can be thousands and thousands of dollars to have a visiting curator, a visiting artist. Why don't we do that for the Indigenous people that are sharing so much of who they are? At great detriment to themselves sometimes at great risk. So that's another thing to think about. So again, like you said, like Melissa and Yarrow said, talk in the present, share the language prominently, pay them adequately, allow that the voices of the Indigenous are the originators of what the story is being told. And be honest. I know that's tough. Be honest about where you are in your equity efforts in your community. Be transparent and try, actually don't try. Be equitable. Be equitable. So thank you.
Yes, I hear also that theme of, one concrete way that we can really decolonize and share that power is through creating those permanent positions within those institutions that really elevate Indigenous knowledge and also adequately paying Indigenous people for their knowledge and recognizing that so often that hasn't been the case. That's one of the ways of doing that. So thank you for speaking to that very concrete example as well. So without further ado, for this question, if you had the authority to govern a museum and you could access their entire collection, what would you do? How would you center Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples? So this is sort of essentially saying, if you kind of had free reign, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you in terms of what you would love to, how you would make changes or what you would do? Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay. Yeah. So this is like that one of those questions, right? That's so huge, right? What would you do? And I read something this morning, as I was just kind of getting ready for my day, by Joy Harjo. And it's plant songs where there were curses. And I think too that, I'm learning more and more about the importance of our cultural objects and how they are so connected, not only to the animals and the land, but to our sort of spiritual connection and our spiritual balance. Those things, those animals, that land, it only came to us, and we were only able to harvest from it, and we were only able to gather from it, and those animals only presented themselves because we were doing good things. And part of like that honoring of that animal's gift to us, that land's gift to us, is to make things from its body. And that is what the institutions hold. They hold that sort of story, that connection, right? And so many of like elders that I keep talking about like what's the right thing to do, how do I bring elders into collections and museums with me? There's a discussion of like the pain of seeing those things there, the pain of knowing that that those things that maybe they were supposed to be burned, or they were supposed to be returned to the land, or they were supposed to live with families and communities until they lived their whole life, until they were made into something else from its like scraps of hide. And so for me, it's like, is that I would try to change, the minds of everyone who came in contact with those things, is seeing them as not a marker of history, but a continuum of our people and who we are. I think that when things are collected into museums, it's almost as if like they are archived and tagged to sort of represent, Indigenous human life, right? And it represents it, and that's what it is. And here it goes. We're moving on into the future, right? I would like to see all of us sort of change our minds about the way that we interact with those things, and the way that we see them, and seeing them as part of us, because if you see something as part of you, you're going to care for it in a different way. And I would really try to empower, all of, everyone in this room, everyone in this Zoom room, and everyone who's working at museums today is to see themselves as maybe not separate from those things, see themselves and the work that they're doing as an opportunity and a power, that they have, to do the right thing, to extend the story, to help sort of usher, this living thing, these amazing collections, that are our ancestors, and that are, buzzing with life and with history, and with that sort of spiritual connection, of the hunter, of the person who gathered that. And how do you become part of that story? How do you, help that cultural piece, reach its people, be significant in people's lives. Maybe we need to start recontextualizing what we think our jobs are, is rather than seeing these things as something we have to preserve for the past, and more of how do we make them live in our lives right now? How do we make them live in the life of the Indigenous people here, of every visitor that comes, I think access is just so important. And if you think of access as being like your whole goal, right? If you just try to rethink what the perspective is, and take it on yourself, I think that there's a lot of separation that happens within institutions and museums, that sort of systematically they were kind of designed to keep us separate, to keep that glass between us, as like the past, and the present, right? And we need to start like removing that glass, and seeing it as part of our lives. And that's not just Indigenous people, right? That's all of us. We're all here today, and we're all in contact with these like incredibly powerful things, these incredibly powerful ancestors and beings. So how do you, as that collection staff, as that archivist, as that curator, help usher that story, help usher sort of the story of those ancestors, so they can continue to live in our lives and not just be, relics of the past, or some sort of marker of time that's no longer here. you know. I think that that I would really like to see everyone sort of take this on as like a responsibility. You know, we're here talking, you know, because we're museum professionals, but also because we're Native people, right? But I would hope that 5 years, 10 years, that everyone who's sitting here listening, you know, anything, if you've taken anything from this discussion, that you look at it now as a responsibility, that it's not just on my shoulders, it's not just on Yarrow's shoulders, it's just not on Lisa's shoulders, that it's on all of our shoulders. This is the burden of working within institutions and museums and being connected to these ancestors, that this is all of our jobs to usher that story, you know, and to help sort of change the dynamic of how these things can be, you know. So yeah, I apologize. I do have to go. I had a previous commitment, but I appreciate everyone, Janan, so much, to Lisa and Yarrow, and you know, thank you just so much. I really appreciate being asked to be here. Apologies for missing the questions.
No, Qunmiġu so much for taking the time to be here and share, you know, so much from your heart. I know you got to go, so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I just wanted to thank you for being here for the time that you could. You really added so much to this conversation. And well, I know that this won't be the last time that we'll be able to have a good conversation with you. So until then, take good care and have a good rest of your day today. Wow, that was a really incredible answer from her. I really appreciated what she shared about encouraging people to think of this as our collective responsibility, not just something that falls on the shoulders of Indigenous peoples, which is so often how it can be. And so I really appreciated what she shared around that. Yarrow or Lisa, want to give you time as well to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fascinating to listen to. I just wanted to, something that she said really triggered a memory for me about maybe some of the objects should have been burned, perhaps, right? And when I was quite a bit younger, I did an internship with Alaska Corporation in partnership with the Forest Service, and it was a archaeological project. We were doing excavation at a quite an ancient site, but as we were there, we had sort of this side task that we did as well, and we went down to a no longer used village, Qunmiġu, near Heidelberg, and we there was a totem pole there that had fallen and that had been monitored for a while and had been leaning and had finally fallen all the way to the ground. And so they had us go down and remove it and load it up on a boat and very carefully, you know, brought it out of the woods and brought it in towards town, unloaded it on the dock, and put it in storage there. And we were told that they were going to be not repairing it, but probably recreating it, right? And using that as a pattern to be recreated. And when we got into town, we had quite a different reception than we anticipated. And the folks were all very somber and very, you know, it was not a joyful experience for them at all. And, you know, they explained to us that it was like bringing in the body of one of their ancestors, this totem pole that was moss covered and rotting and falling apart. They treated it like it was a deceased ancestor, and they would have preferred that it had been left to decay and deteriorate where it was. You know, so that's an example of best intentions might not have been explored thoroughly with the people who it was representing, right? So even the Native individuals that were involved, you know, didn't really have the authority to be speaking for that entire culture, right? And so that was just one thing, you know, one example of perspective there that I think we can learn a lot from in that experience. And other experiences that I've had, and I know I'm kind of answering this question a little broadly, but I attended a basket repairing workshop here at the Alaska State Museum with Ellen, and it was a fascinating workshop. And she was having us doing these repair with this like paper tissue and stuff, and at one point, you know, that it doesn't add any structural integrity to the basket, but it just like allows a visual patch, if you will, right? And so there was gosh, I think it was a hat that we were looking at that that I suggested, well, why don't we just use more spruce root to repair it with? And you know, that was kind of contrary to the preservation techniques that we were being taught, and yet coming at it from the perspective of a native artist and weaver who would wear a hat similar to that, right? If I had a hat that was tearing or wearing, I would repair it, and so that it would not continue to be damaged and could continue its life of use, right? And so, you know, that's really often conflicting perspectives there, you know, as far as like what is the ultimate goal of the preservation, in what way is it being preserved, in an authentic and continued use state, or in its original unaltered state, right? And so, you know, we really had this deep discussion at that time of the differences of how we each would have approached that repair, and in terms of how something like that would be used, and continuing its life as a museum object rather than continuing its life as a hat being performed. And so with that, I wanted to really acknowledge some of the practices that the State Museum here has been doing for a long time, and really uphold what they are doing, and that is partnering with a lot of the Native people and tribes and individuals and leaders in housing objects for them, and allowing them to come in and retrieve them when needed for ceremonial use. And so, you know, some of the objects are owned by the tribal individuals or the tribe as a general whole collective, and some of them are owned by the museum that are allowed to be released in that way to specified authorized individuals for ceremonial use. And so those moments are just so incredible that you kind of get the best of both worlds, right? Where you get the object preserved in a way that is up to our modern standards, in an atmosphere controlled environment and stabilized as best as possible, and yet also allowed to continue its life of ceremonial use and representation and meaning, like the other speakers were saying about this relationship with the object as a spirit, right? And continuing that. And I realize that that's not possible sometimes with objects that have been treated with pesticides or things like that, where, you know, it's really not recommended to touch them or contact it with your body. I've been in workshops in the last couple of years doing some 3D rendering with photogrammetry. It was a fascinating project, and really looked at, you know, some of the way we can progress into preserving objects, right? In a way that we could take a 3D model of it and present it digitally in a way that you can manipulate it in a way that sometimes you can't with a real object, right? If you have a 3D rendering, done appropriately, you can twist it and turn it and zoom in and out and get right up close to it in a way that that would damage a fragile artifact. And so I think those are things that we can really bring to light that are moving into the future, right? Of ways of bringing this cultural partnership and responsibility into the future, right? And so my friend Vivian has been going on and on with me about this virtual reality and this like headset thing you can put on, and took me into this like spacewalk thing, and I got really bad vertigo from it from my first experience of it. But you know, it really opened my eyes to some of what's possible, and we literally could go in and create a representation of a tribal dwelling at various stages of time, you know, even though we may not have a specific artifact that exists right now with, you know, that is properly collected and information tagged and represented about it. But you know, we know enough about it that we could create a digital representation of so many different things and let people have that experience of seeing and looking at what the light or the, you know, the sound would be in that situation. And similarly, using similar techniques of creating that digital image that can also be used to render models, right? Replicas. And I have gotten a chance to see some of those, and it's kind of a controversial process, right? And I've gotten to see some of the atlatls that are a spear throwing aid that were 3D rendered, and getting to see kids using them and learning how to throw a spear in the way that their ancestors would have, and that's really precious. And then also seeing a clan hat that had been replicated and how that created controversy in different ways, and you know, really questions of moral obligation, right? Where's the ownership lie? Where does the copyright lie? Who owns the template for it? Who owns the design for it? Who owns the original? Who owns the copy, right? And so all of those things are questions to be addressed, right, by our collective responsibilities, and not necessarily detrimental in one way or the other, but making sure that the viewpoint of the people being represented is being respected. And you know, I think one of the things that for me is the most powerful is bringing groups of tribal people into the collections, and letting them see the objects as they are, letting them pick it up gently and look at the back to see the stitches and draw and sketch and take pictures of things and discover things that they may not have anticipated. Like we brought one group in and they were just delighted to see on these, I believe it was a little pair of moccasins that had a patch of skin. I believe it was like an eagle down skin on these moccasins. They were just blown away by it, right? And just the experience of getting to see that was really precious to them. And so that access to those individuals, I think, is really important, of bringing them in and giving them time to spend with them, and allowing them the ceremonial, the living connection with those objects. But also allowing some of the objects to go out and continue that ceremonial use is very important. I really, really respect the folks that have set up those agreements, and I wish we could do it with more of them, right? And then also when we bring in groups of kids that come in from other villages and they get to see objects that they may not have had an opportunity to. I think it's important to look at maybe not hoarding everything like a dragon would, right? You know, it's not holding everything in the box, but you know, when tribal organizations or villages have an opportunity to set up their own facilities that have preservation methods and techniques and technology, I think it's important to have those things that are meaningful to those villages, to those people, individuals, return to them in a way that isn't necessarily detrimental to the institution as a whole, but rather expanding the scope of what that institution's goal is, right? Is preservation of these objects for the longest extent of time possible, but also bringing them back into the life of the cultural use that they were intended, and supporting and, you know, offering advice and techniques and, you know, help in setting them up. And, you know, I think those are the kind of things that we can really move into the future with, of, you know, allowing these sort of smaller collections that are much more localized and specific to the areas that they're in. And I recognize, you know, that the organization I work for is a state organization. That, you know, it represents the entire state here. And so in that way, I think it's important to maintain some of those for sure. But maybe not all of them, right? There's thousands of things that are in the vault that never get put out on display, you know, and they're there for research or for different people to access if requested. But maybe the future could allow for setting up several smaller sites, sort of satellite museums, if you will. I think is something that I would like to see if I had control of all of that, right? I would like to see them being represented as authentically as possible in their home communities, so that the people there don't have to travel out of town to experience their own cultural objects. I think that would be important. I think that the hands-on collections are really important. And I know recently we've been limiting access to those in a way because of COVID and, you know, the world that we live in now, not wanting to share the germs and diseases with every person who comes and goes. But, you know, I think that for Native people, touch is such an important part of experiencing something. It's different than just looking at it, but hearing and seeing and smelling and touch is a part of that. And so I really think that those hands-on collections are important, to let them, you know, turn it around and twist it and feel the texture of things, of the difference between a rawhide and the carved wood, or the sinew or the bone point, or things of those natures, right? And allow for things like a child to come in and have a set of regalia put on them, right? So that they could feel the weight of what a headdress might feel like, or, you know, those things in a controlled, you know, setting where they're not going to damage it or themselves or anything. But to have that be a really special experience, I think would be neat for some of the youth groups that come through. I really appreciate the program that the Sitka Museum has been running, where they're loaning objects to classrooms, and they have that opportunity available for teachers to reach out and bring some of those into the classroom. And so I think that's an important way of spreading that education, right? Of letting those kids see and touch, and not having to travel outside of their community to experience those things. So I really appreciate those kind of programs. I think that could probably be done a lot more, and allowing digital access, right? There was a a robot that went around and you could steer and control where it went to look at the object and zoom in and whatever. I really appreciated that opportunity for people, even when the museum was closed, that they allowed that opportunity for people to continue the experiences. And so with that, I wanted to just wrap up with sharing with you guys that let's see, what is Thursday and Friday of this week, I'm going to be going out and working with a group of students, a culture camp, who have made their own halibut hooks in the Tlingit style, where they have a carved piece of wood and kind of a angle shaped. I don't know if you guys have all seen it, with sort of a spike on the inside, and then it's hung with a float. And we're going to be taking them out in our canoe as a group, and they're going to be setting their halibut hooks and actually seeing if they can catch halibut with these hooks that they've replicated. I'm sure at one point them or their instructors came in and visited the museum and got to see the collections of hooks that were on exhibit or in the holding, and then worked with them to create a lesson plan and recreated them and brought them the materials and the technique and the opportunity to do it. And now we're going to take them out and take them fishing with authentic recreated halibut hooks of their own. So I think that kind of real life experience is very, very important as far as perpetuating living culture.
Gnachish, Yarrow. Lots of good thought there. Good food for thought as well. Yeah, I'm there's just pondering on the different stories that you told. The visuals of the kids interacting with the objects, especially, and then the last one that you shared of the students going out to actually test their halibut hooks. That's beautiful. Yeah, and that is an example of how a partnership like that with the museum can really lead to the perpetuation of our cultures into the future in a really beautiful way, in a meaningful way. Yeah, so Gnachish for sharing. And the story that you also shared about the totem pole, that it wasn't actually, there were many people in the community that actually felt it should have stayed there. That really shows how complex these issues can be, and just why it is so important to really value Indigenous knowledge and perspective on these issues, and also to, like others have said, to also value it in long-term ways through positions and through funding and all of those different things, right? Because these are really complex issues, and what someone else might think is the right way to handle things could actually be really counterintuitive to what the community feels is right. So yeah, I just appreciate you sharing these different perspectives, and the beauty of the different stories you told, right, is people will get a different lesson out of them, depending on where they are at and what they need to hear right now. So thank you. Lisa, I also wanted to give you a chance to share on this question.
Yes. So I think just answering this question directly, if I had the authority to go govern a museum like down in the lower 48, like, I don't know, Oakland or Phoebehurst or I don't know, just somewhere down there, right? And I know that they have items from my area of the world. The first thing I would do is I would be very honest in examining how this institution came into possession of this item. What is the story behind how this ancestor came to this place, was brought to this place? I think it's really important to be honest about how those objects and ancestors are now housed in this location. Very, very important. Next, I would look at what are the repatriation policies of my institution and how are they practiced? Because you can have policies, but it may not line up with the actual practice. So it's really important to understand that, and understand the reasons why those policies might not be practiced according to what the policy says. So really understanding those two things first, I think, are very, very important. And understanding the museum's relationship to the Indigenous community in the place that it's located, on whose land it's located. And then I think that another thing that's not talked about is a lot of museums put numbers to the value of objects and those things, how they're assessed and how much insurance is on those things. That goes to the cash value of that institution. That's something we don't talk about, and that's one of the major reasons why there's a reluctance to repatriate items and ancestors. We have to talk about that. We have to be honest about that. There's money in this, and it can boil down to that ultimately. We have to think about that. And then there's a lot of intangible property, cultural, intellectual property, intangibles that are not, institutions don't have authority to be displaying or claiming to own or in possession of. So songs, dances, kinships, relationships. There's a whole nother realm that Western law doesn't account for. Its mechanisms don't allow for us to be able to utilize it very well in the protection of intangible. So I think, and these are things personally I would do, right? And it's a lot harder to do than to say. It's a very difficult process, and it's a very lengthy process because, as Yarrow mentioned, there are differing opinions and authorities inside of Indigenous communities. Like, who has the authority in the Indigenous community to say you can do this or you can do that? Who made them that authority? So we have to talk directly to tribal councils, right? We have to engage entire communities, and that can be very tough, but it's super important. I think bringing people from communities, as Yarrow and Melissa said, into the space, able to really engage and begin that process of consultation is super important. Bringing those individuals, elders, community members, even young people into the consultation process, as many people from the community as possible, is important. And I think that, as Yarrow said, if museums and communities come into an agreement where those ancestors, those objects, those things of life and love, if they are in agreement to be housed in that institution, to continue to be housed in that institution, that they are able to be, we decentralize that museum, like you said, Yarrow, bring those items out to the communities, because not everybody has access to those items, and we've done that over the past couple of years. We're a fairly new institution. We were opened in 2016 during the end of the year. So we've had just a few years of operation, but in those few years, we've been able to take traveling exhibits out into the communities. Every single one of our exhibits were developed in direct consultation and partnership with the communities of origin. So we make sure to go out into the communities with those traveling exhibits. And we haven't for the past 2 years because of COVID, but we're just about to kick off with this upcoming school year with a couple of trips to some of the region's communities. So we're excited. So I agree wholeheartedly with that. So those are the things I wanted to share. And I know they're kind of very time consuming, very long process to start, but absolutely important. Ellanna.
Yeah, just you couldn't have said it better. The process that you laid out there in terms of the work that it takes. It is real work, and it, like you said, it's not something that can be done overnight. It really requires a long-term sort of systemic commitment to really doing it in the right way. But it is so worth it because along as you go along this process, I can only imagine the transformation that would take place in terms of the relationship between that museum and not only the Indigenous peoples on whose land it's on, but also the Indigenous communities for all of all the different cultural items that it may have in its collections, and being able to really no longer be sort of another vehicle of colonization, although I don't think a lot of people intend it to be. I think museums so often can perpetuate those dynamics, right? And a museum doesn't have to be a vehicle of that. It can actually be a vehicle of decolonization. And I think a lot of beautiful things would come from that. So thank you so much for sharing what part of that entails. And I think it really is worth it to embark down that path as challenging as it is. I think it's just as, if not more, worthwhile. So that was the end of our sort of official questions that we wanted to pose to our panelists here. But we did get a question in the chat. Many museums have these, demonstrations or residencies. The museum that this person works at also has a residency program for Alaska Natives. And it sort of involves Alaska Native artists giving, talks on the subjects that they can choose to. So they get to decide what subjects they work within and what they talk about. They can teach classes if they like, and also get paid for their work in that while they're doing it. And so, I think we're starting to see more and more museums creating these kinds of partnerships and artist residencies, which is a great thing. And, one of the things that this person says that they do is they make sure to have these exit interviews and ask, what they can do to improve their program, which is, definitely a good practice. And so they were wondering if either Lisa or Yarrow, or maybe both of you, had any thoughts around what else can be done in general to improve those kinds of residency programs. Is it, are there things that come to mind in terms of growing what a residency program could be or could do, or maybe it's even, starting some kind of complementary program? I'll leave you all to kind of take the question how you will, and invite either of you to share.
And I think those are very, very valuable programs for sure, and that have been developing recently and really highlighting and recognizing Native artists and specialists. So I really appreciate when those opportunities come up. I appreciate that they've been available online as well through programs like Zoom like this, you know, so that people who aren't necessarily present there can listen to a lecture or something, or recordings that can be posted up on the website later. It's more than just sitting down for a couple of hours to do the project, right? There's hours and hours and hours of prep work and gathering and very seasonally time specific moments of harvesting from different regions. And so, you know, workshops like that, I think, can be promoted as well, of gathering, but also in cultivating some of those resources. Like I know outside of our state museum here, there's, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, I've asked, but nobody's quite answered me, but there's grass there that is most likely the same kind of grass that we would use for some false embroidery for basketry, right? And so, you know, I think cultivating these like cultural gardens where we could then actually use some of those materials and use them to teach classes or to create new artworks with, I think would be kind of a fun way of doing that as well, and could sort of expand into this like outdoor exhibit, if you will, you know, so you can put up labels and, you know, help tell stories of what those things are. And it's such a difference of seeing this green swaying grass outside, and then you go inside and you see the beautiful things that it was created with. I think making those kind of connections might be add to that kind of program as well. Just one thought.
Yeah, Ganesh, I like that. There's a lot of cultural protocol that you only learn when you're harvesting, right? I'm just thinking about the process of harvesting cedar, which I am not equipped to speak about. But from what I've seen, it is exactly what you described. There's hours of prep work involved. You have to be very intentional about how you go about every stage of that harvesting, and across all of our cultures, the way that we harvest and prepare for these art forms is in and of itself a moment where a lot of cultural teaching happens. So thank you for bringing up that perspective.
If I could add one more thing.
Sure.
Expanding that idea too, also to ecological preservation is important in creating heritage sites of importance of where those materials are gathered from. Like here, one of the best places that we can get spruce roots from here is on an area that is outskirting the airport here. And so we've been able to work out agreements with them on occasion to get escorted by an airport authority to take a group of students out there and stand next to the runway and gather roots under the trees. And, you know, the airport folks are very gracious in it, but, you know, they don't have any idea what we're doing or why they're there. And so they're just, you know, asking questions and watching how we do it and wondering why we can't go get those roots somewhere else, right? Why are we coming here to this weird secure location to get it, right? Because that's the best spot where they grow, perfectly, you know, long and easy to get under the moss and things like that, right? And so I think more and more as our communities are being developed and, you know, pollution is spreading and, you know, all sorts of things are impacting our local environments. I think it's important to preserve those areas of where those resources are located at, and specifically the cedars, like you mentioned, and recently was able to travel down to Hawaii with a group focusing on some canoe methodology and looking at their ancient forests. And, you know, what is it, about 30 years ago, we had sent down some cedar trees from here for them to create their canoes with, because they no longer had the size of trees needed to make that project with. And so, you know, I think part of that responsibility is not just saving and preserving the one object, but in saving and preserving the whole environment, the whole living culture of the environment as well, of, you know, preserving that ecosystem of that it takes to grow a canoe-sized cedar tree. You know, I think they're really pretty rare these days. And speaking with one of the master carvers recently, and he's, you know, ethically, is it really the right thing to do to harvest those trees, even if you're wanting to make a carved canoe with it, right? Is it better to just leave that tree standing in order to continue to perpetuate that healthy forest? So I think those are some of the things that can be addressed and sort of expanded into, you know, maybe that's not necessarily the responsibility of a museum per se, but certainly partnerships that can be developed and information that can be collaboratively resourced, I think. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that part to it.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, that is another important aspect of it as well. The health and well-being of the land is essential to supporting this ongoing practice. These are essential to ensuring that these practices are able to continue on into the future.
Yeah.
Lisa, I wanted to give you time as well if you wanted to share something to this question. What can we do to improve artist residency programs, or perhaps like Yarrow shared, there's a whole other set of programming that we should be thinking about.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. So a few years back, before our resident elder, Vincent Picawana, passed away, he partnered with the Qunmiġu Cultural Center in doing a 1-month residency with the KCC, but located at the school. And he taught a group of young people from all over the region at our regional technical center how to make a kayak. And he taught about the math involved in making that kayak, the specific dimensions needed per the person who was piloting the kayak. And he talked about the spiritual significance of each part of the kayak. So they didn't only learn just how to build it, but they learned about the spiritual significance of each piece, of each part, of each role of each part, and its direct relationship to the pilot, to the individual pilot that it was being built for. And along the way, he shared his stories, his experiences of when his dad made him his kayak and how he taught him about each piece. And when he was, it led to just this really powerful experience for these young people to be absolutely immersed in who they are as Indigenous people. And they learned from him about the ceremonies associated with becoming a young man in his community. He taught them about, he told them stories about how to read the weather and knowing what kind of ice is safe to walk on and what is not. He talked about the environment in relation to our place, so specifically that one of the memories the young people walked away with was that when you walk away on the ice from King Island, you know that you've reach the limit of safety when you look back at the island and it looks like it's drinking a glass of water. You look back at the island and you say, it's drinking a glass of water, I better start going back to the island. Because it has kind of I wish my video was working, I'm sorry, but it looks kind of like there's two humps, like a camel's back almost, King Island. So there's a section that dips in the middle. So if you get further away enough from something, you kind of can see the mirage it causes, that section where the dip is to be cut off, and it looks like two masses. So when the island is drinking water, that's when you know you've met the limit of safety and you have to go back. So there was so much in relation to place that he taught them. So including that daily youth apprenticeship, like Yarrow was mentioning, opportunity is something that's going to have a very powerful impact on Indigenous young people and their sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves, their sense of strength and understanding who they are and where they come from, provides them strength in their life and everything. So yes, residencies are extremely important. We were about to do a Qunmiġu. We did a Qunmiġu building session after the kayak building, but we didn't get a chance to do the covering the Qunmiġu with the walrus hide portion of our project because our elder had passed on. So we're in the middle of planning out our next residency in partnership with the NACTEC BSSD Northwest Arctic Technical Center. They take high school kids and do summer residents, have residencies at the summer session. So I would also like to echo about the environmental sovereignty aspect. It's more than just food security. It's more than co-management. It is environmental sovereignty, our ability to be who we are on our original lands. It includes the stewardship. It includes the management of our resources. And it includes our ability to safeguard against things that are harmful to our environment. So yes, I agree absolutely 100% with that. We are in the process of taking a look at what our school year schedule is going to be, and we were thinking about ways to engage youth in things that are deeply connected to who they are as Indigenous people, but at the same time absolutely pulling them in because they're super interested in these things. So it's a lot of fun to try to conceive of what these projects are going to look like. But I think that the way that we've done it in the past is to engage with the young people and ask them, ask elders what's important to be passed on. Ask the young people what you're interested in learning, and go from there. So thank you so much for talking about residencies. And Yarrow, I'd like to connect with you at some point and learn a little bit more about your program.
This has been such a good session. Lisa, I really enjoyed what you said of your story about the elder and really giving him the ability to expand on what it is to be a good person in our communities, what it is to be a Native person, and all the responsibilities that we hold. You know, that kind of residency isn't just about learning an artistic skill. It's about learning how to be a Native person and the responsibilities that that comes with. That kind of thing is so important to building our identity and realizing what our ancestors did for us and our responsibility to the next generations. Our conversation today has interwoven so many different pieces of Indigenous knowledge and how to uphold that Indigenous knowledge as equal to non-Indigenous knowledge. And you've created space to really allow us to think about what that would look like and what that means for museums and other institutions, and given us some really good ideas on how to take that action into our places of work. We are coming to the close of our gathering today. And so I want to express a deep thank you, a deep koyana to Lisa, Yarrow, and Melissa, who've been able to guide us through this conversation and really open our minds and hearts.